At 11:47 on a Friday night, Grace Bellamy typed out the angriest text message of her life, hit send before she could talk herself out of it, and accidentally ended a 5-year relationship with a complete stranger instead of the man who deserved it. "We're done, Marcus. I found the hotel receipts. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't show up at my apartment. I mean it this time." The reply came back 4 minutes later, and it was nothing like what she expected. Wrong number. But if Marcus is stupid enough to cheat on someone who writes texts that sharp, come over. I'll make you forget his name by midnight. Grace stared at her phone in the dim light of her kitchen, a half-packed suitcase open on the counter beside her. The one she'd been filling with Marcus's things for the last hour, folding his shirts with more violence than the task strictly required, and felt something close to a laugh escape her chest, sharp and startled. The first thing that had felt like relief in weeks. She did not know. Typing back a reply she told herself was harmless, that the man on the other end of that message was Damian Cross, and that the number she'd copied wrong by exactly one transposed digit belonged to a man 3 federal agencies had spent years trying to reach through considerably more official channels than a misdirected breakup text. "That's a bold offer for a wrong number," she wrote. "I don't make offers I don't intend to keep. Ask around." Grace huffed out another laugh, sitting down at her kitchen table with the phone cradled between both hands, adrenaline from the last hour still burning through her system, looking for somewhere to land now that the actual target of her fury was 3 states away at a conference she'd only just discovered was a lie. "I'm not coming to a stranger's house at midnight because my boyfriend is a liar. Fiancé, technically," she added a moment later, glancing at the ring still on her finger, twisting it off with her free hand and setting it on the table like something contaminated. "Ex-fiancé," came the reply. "And smart. I wouldn't trust a stranger at midnight either. Ask me anything you want first. I'll answer honestly," which is more than Marcus apparently managed. Grace should have stopped there. She would think, later, replaying the entire strange unraveling of that night, that this was the exact moment a sensible woman closes her phone and goes to bed angry like a normal person. Instead, something reckless and curious, some part of her that had spent 5 years being careful and reasonable and endlessly patient with a man who repaid all of it with hotel receipts, wanted to know more. "What's your name?" "Damian." "Just Damian?" "For tonight, that's enough." "What's yours?" "Grace." "And before you ask, no, I'm not the kind of person who does this. Text strangers. Consider midnight invitations from men I've never met." "Neither am I," Damian wrote back, "which tells me tonight is unusual for both of us." They talked for 2 hours. Not about anything that mattered, not at first. Grace's job at a small architecture firm downtown, her ridiculous ex-fiance's inability to lie convincingly even under direct confrontation, the ficus plant she'd bought 3 years ago and somehow kept alive despite what she called an aggressive lack of gardening talent. Damian answered every question with a directness that surprised her, though she noticed, somewhere past 1 in the morning, that he never once mentioned what he did for a living, deflecting the question twice with an ease that should have concerned her more than it did. She did not know, that first night, that the man she was laughing with over spilled wine and burnt popcorn stories controlled shipping routes along the entire eastern seaboard. That 4 separate law enforcement agencies maintained active files with his photograph in them. Or that the last woman who had gotten genuinely close to Damian Cross had been used, 6 years earlier, as leverage in a war that had cost him more than he'd ever spoken about to anyone since. What Grace knew, closing her phone somewhere near 2 in the morning with a smile she hadn't worn in weeks, was simpler and considerably more dangerous than any of that. She wanted to know what he sounded like in person. They met properly 6 days later, at a small cafe near Grace's office that Damian had suggested with a specificity that told her he'd chosen it carefully, quiet, half empty on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked into a corner with 2 exits she wouldn't notice him clocking until much later. Once she understood exactly what kind of habits a man like him never fully switched off, she recognized him the moment she walked in, though she couldn't have said how. Something about the way he sat, unhurried, entirely still in a way most people weren't, watching the door without seeming to watch it at all. "You're taller than I imagined," Grace said, sliding into the seat across from him. "You're exactly what I imagined," Damian said, which is unusual. Most people don't match their texts. Grace studied him for a long moment, the expensive but understated suit, the watch that cost more than her monthly rent, the careful, controlled way he held himself, even in a coffee shop that posed absolutely no threat to anyone. What do you do, Damian? You dodged that question 5 times in 2 hours the other night. 6, actually, Damian said. I was hoping you wouldn't count. I'm an architect. Counting things is basically my whole personality. Something in his face shifted, amused despite himself. I run several businesses. Shipping, mostly. Some real estate. That's a very vague answer for a man who just told me he doesn't dodge questions. It's the truest answer I can give you right now, Damian said, and something in his voice, careful, weighing something she couldn't see, made Grace set down her coffee cup and actually look at him properly. That sounds like the beginning of a warning. It might be, Damian admitted. I'd rather be honest about that than pretend to otherwise a month from now. Once it's harder to walk away. Grace sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way she turned over a difficult client brief, looking for the load-bearing wall inside a sentence that seemed determined not to give her anything solid to stand on. Are you dangerous? She asked, plainly, because 5 years with Marcus had taught her that careful. Indirect questions rarely got her anything but careful, indirect answers, and she'd promised herself, packing his shirts into that suitcase 6 days ago, that she was done accepting anything less than the truth. Damian didn't answer immediately, and the silence told her more than words might have. Some people would say yes, he said finally. I've made decisions in my life I'm not proud of. I run in circles most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid. If you asked around Grace, you'd hear things about me that would probably send you running. And some of them would even be true. That's not really an answer. It's the only honest one I have, Damian said. I could tell you I'm harmless. It would be easier, and you might even believe it long enough to matter. I'd rather you know exactly what you're deciding to get closer to, if that's what you decide to do. Grace looked at him for a long moment, something in his directness landing harder than any reassurance could have, because Marcus, she understood now with the clarity of 6 days' distance, had never once given her that. Every lie he told had been engineered specifically to make things easier for her to believe, easier for her to stay, easier for him to keep doing exactly what he wanted while she remained comfortably, deliberately unaware. I appreciate that you're not lying to make this simpler, she said slowly. But I need you to understand something too, Damian. I just spent 5 years with a man who made everything sound simple and turned out to be exactly the kind of complicated that ruins a person's life quietly, one hidden receipt at a time. I don't know if I have room for a different, bigger kind of complicated right now. That's fair, Damian said. I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm asking you to have coffee with me and see whether the version of me you've built out of a few text messages actually matches the man sitting across from you. Grace studied him a moment longer, weighing the careful honesty against every instinct telling her that walking toward a man who described himself in terms this guarded was its own kind of reckless she couldn't quite justify to herself yet. One coffee, she said finally. No promises beyond that. They talked for 2 hours, easily, the same effortless rhythm from that first strange night finding its footing in person now. Damian asking about her work with a genuine, specific curiosity that surprised her, Grace finding herself laughing more freely than she had in months, both of them carefully avoiding, by unspoken agreement, any further questions about shipping routes or the particular reasons a man might need to sit facing a door. Neither of them noticed the man in the gray coat who had followed Damian from his car that morning, sitting 3 tables away with a newspaper he wasn't reading, photographing the two of them together with a phone held just low enough to avoid drawing attention, information that would, within the week, find its way to a rival who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening into Damian Cross's carefully guarded life. The photographs reached Salvatore Reyes 3 days later, delivered by a courier who had learned, over the years, exactly how much a man like Salvatore was willing to pay for the right kind of leverage. Salvatore studied them for a long time, Damian Cross, laughing, unguarded, across a small table from a woman nobody in his organization recognized, no family name, no connections, nothing that made her valuable except, apparently, whatever she meant to the one man Salvatore had spent a decade failing to properly threaten. Find out everything about her, Salvatore told the man standing across his desk. Name, job, family, routine, everything. It took 4 days. By the following Monday, Salvatore had a file thick enough to satisfy him. Grace Bellamy, 29, an architect at a mid-sized downtown firm, recently and publicly ended an engagement, no siblings. A mother in Connecticut she visited monthly, an aging father with a heart condition that made him, conveniently, an easy target for exactly the kind of pressure Salvatore's business specialized in applying. He did not move immediately. Men like Salvatore understood patience the same way Damian did, that the most effective leverage was leverage held quietly, ready, until the exact moment it would cost the most to use. Grace, unaware entirely of the file being built around her, spent those same 2 weeks falling into something she hadn't expected to fall into at all. Damian was unlike anyone she dated, careful in ways that felt protective rather than controlling, direct in ways Marcus had never once managed to be, and possessed of a quiet, watchful attentiveness that made her feel, for the first time in years, genuinely seen rather than simply accommodated. "You do that thing," she told him, 3 weeks into whatever this had become, sitting across from him at a restaurant he'd chosen with the same careful attention to exits and sightlines she'd noticed at the cafe, "where you watch the door like you're waiting for something." "Old habit," Damian said. "A habit from what, exactly?" He was quiet a moment, weighing, she understood by now, exactly how much of his actual life he was willing to hand her at once. "I told you I run businesses that not everyone would consider legitimate," he said finally. "I wasn't being coy, Grace. I need you to understand that clearly, because I think you've been letting yourself not fully hear it." Something in his tone made Grace set down her fork. "Tell me plainly then, what are you actually saying?" "I'm the head of an organization most people would call organized crime," Damian said, meeting her eyes without flinching from the weight of it. "Shipping, real estate, some interests I won't detail over dinner. I have enemies who would use anyone close to me as leverage without hesitation. I have already, this month, had you photographed by someone working for a rival I've spent a decade trying to contain." He paused. "I'm telling you this now, plainly, because I'd rather lose you tonight with the truth than keep you a month longer under a version of me that isn't real." Grace sat with it, feeling the weight of the words settle slowly. None of the shock she expected arriving quite the way she'd braced for. Not because she wasn't frightened, but because some part of her, she realized, had already understood most of this without letting herself name it directly. "Someone's been photographing me," she said instead of anything else, focusing on the detail that actually mattered. "Yes. 2 weeks ago, at the cafe. I only confirmed it yesterday. And you're telling me now because it's no longer fair to let you make choices about this without knowing the actual risk," Damian said. "I should have told you the day I found out." Grace looked at him for a long moment. This man who had answered a wrong number text with an offer half serious, half honest, and had spent 3 weeks since being more transparent with her than the man she'd almost married had managed in 5 years. "What happens to people you care about?" she asked slowly. "When your enemies find out you care about them?" Damian's jaw tightened, something old and painful moving behind his controlled expression. "6 years ago, a woman I was involved with was taken and used as leverage against me for 11 days before I got her back. She survived. She also never spoke to me again, and I don't blame her." He held Grace's gaze steadily. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you into staying, Grace. I'm telling you because you deserve to walk away tonight with your eyes fully open, if walking away is what you decide to do." Grace sat in the quiet of that restaurant for a long moment, adrenaline and fear and something else entirely, a strange, unshakable clarity, settling over her all at once. "I spent 5 years," she said finally, "with a man who lied to make things easier for both of us, and it cost me every ounce of trust I had left to give anyone. You've just told me the single most terrifying thing anyone could tell me about your life, and you told me the truth plainly, with nothing softened." She reached across the table, closing her hand over his. "I don't know what I'm choosing yet, Damian. But I know I'm not running from a man who finally, for once, told me exactly what I was risking before I risked it." Neither of them saw, through the restaurant's front window, the same man in the gray coat parked across the street, already dialing a number that would put Salvatore Reyes's plan into motion considerably sooner than either Damian or Grace had any reason to expect. Grace's father called her on a Thursday morning, his voice tight and strange in a way that made her stomach drop before he'd said more than a handful of words. "Gracie, there were men here yesterday," Robert Bellamy said, his breathing audibly labored. The particular strain of a heart condition his doctors had warned him for years not to aggravate with stress. "Asking about you. About your work. Your schedule. They said they were background checkers, some kind of security clearance thing. But your mother thought it was strange, and I—" "Dad, slow down." What did they look like? Suits. Polite. Too polite. A pause, his breathing catching audibly. One of them asked whether you'd been seeing anyone new. Grace's hand tightened around her phone. The careful calm she'd been building over 3 weeks of dating a man who ran an actual criminal organization suddenly feeling considerably less theoretical than it had over candlelit dinners. Dad, I need you to call me if anyone comes back. Anyone at all. Please. She called Damian the moment she hung up and heard, in the 4 seconds of silence before he responded, exactly how seriously he was taking it. Where are your parents right now? He said, his voice already carrying the flat, controlled urgency she'd heard once before. The night Preston's cousin. No, that was a different story. She reminded herself distantly, her thoughts scattering with fear. The night everything had first gone wrong with her own harassment at a firm 2 jobs ago. This was different. This was worse. Connecticut. Their house. Dad has a heart condition, Damian, if someone's threatening him. I'll have men there within the hour, Damian said. Not to frighten your parents further. To make sure nobody gets near that house again without me knowing about it first. A pause, something rawer moving into his voice. Grace, I need you to listen to me carefully. This is Salvatore Reyes. I'm certain of it. He's escalating faster than I expected, which means he already believes you matter enough to me to be worth the risk. You said someone would use me as leverage, Grace said, her voice tight with a fear that had nothing theoretical left in it at all. You said that 3 weeks ago like it was a warning about the future. This is happening right now, Damian, to my father, who has nothing to do with any of this. I know, Damian said, and I am not going to let it go further. I promise you that. You can't promise that, Grace said, something sharp and frightened rising in her voice. You promised the woman 6 years ago too, didn't you? And she was gone for 11 days. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Grace regretted the words the moment the anger behind them faded, leaving only fear in its place. You're right, Damian said finally, quiet, stripped of any of the careful control he usually carried. I can't promise you nothing will go wrong. I can promise you I will use every resource I have to make sure it doesn't. And that this time, I'm not waiting 11 days to act. I'm moving now. Within 2 hours, 4 of Damian's men were stationed discreetly around her parents' Connecticut property, and Grace found herself, for the first time since that first wrong number text, genuinely afraid of what she'd walked into rather than simply intrigued by it. I need to see Salvatore Reyes stopped, she told Damian that evening, sitting in his study, the fear from the morning hardening slowly into something closer to resolve. Not managed. Not contained. Stopped. Permanently, so my father never has to wonder again whether strange men are coming back. That's not a small thing to ask, Damian said carefully. I'm not asking you to do it for me, Grace said. I'm telling you I understand now fully what being with you actually costs. And I'm choosing to stay anyway on one condition. That whatever happens next, you don't handle this the way you handled it 6 years ago. Quietly, alone, and too slowly. Something in Damian's face shifted, surprise, she realized, watching him carefully, at being asked to include someone in the actual solution, rather than simply protect her from the danger of it. What are you suggesting? He said. I'm an architect, Grace said. I read blueprints, structural weaknesses, the places where something looks solid but isn't. Salvatore's been building a case against you through people, through leverage, through fear. That's a structure too, Damian. Structures have load-bearing points. Find his, and the whole thing collapses faster than you think. Damian studied her for a long moment, something that looked almost like a moving behind his controlled expression, not at the plan itself, but at the woman offering it, steady and clear-eyed despite a morning that would have sent most people running in the opposite direction entirely. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. Neither of them yet knew that Salvatore Reyes, watching from a rented apartment 2 blocks from Damian's estate, had already decided that patience had cost him enough, and that his next move would not be a warning at all. Grace's plan took shape over the following 3 days, built from the same careful, methodical instinct that let her spot a structural flaw in a building before it ever became visible to anyone else standing in the room. Salvatore's entire operation runs on fear of exposure, she explained, spreading printouts of financial records Marcus, at Damian's men's discreet request. One of his own analysts had pulled across the study desk. But look at this pattern. Every major move he's made in the last year traces back to 3 shell accounts, all routed through the same offshore bank. That's not diversified. That's a man who trusts one system so completely he never built a backup. Damian studied the pattern she'd circled in red ink, something sharpening behind his eyes. You're saying if we expose that bank's cooperation with his laundering, his entire financial structure collapses at once, Grace said. Not slowly. All three accounts, simultaneously. The moment federal regulators start asking that bank uncomfortable questions. A man like Salvatore doesn't survive losing everything overnight. He survives slow attrition. This isn't slow. It was, Damian admitted quietly, watching her lay out the plan with the same unshaken clarity she'd shown reading blueprints over a candlelit dinner 3 weeks earlier. The single most effective strategy anyone in his organization had proposed in years. They moved on a Tuesday, feeding the information through channels Damian had spent a decade quietly maintaining. Federal contacts who owed him favors, financial regulators who required only the smallest, most legitimate-seeming nudge to begin asking exactly the right questions. Salvatore Reyes did not go quietly. He arrived at Damian's estate 2 days later, alone, no entourage, the desperate, cornered posture of a man who understood, watching his accounts freeze one by one, that he had run out of every option except confrontation. You think exposing my finances ends this, Salvatore said, standing in Damian's study with a coldness that made Grace, watching from the doorway, feel the full weight of exactly what kind of man had been circling her family for weeks. I still have men, Damian. I still have reach. Your little architect isn't safe just because you've frozen some accounts. She's safer, Damian said, than she's ever been, because you no longer have the resources to sustain a war you've already lost. He stepped closer, something cold and absolute settling into his voice. You came to my house, Salvatore. Alone. Which tells me you already understand that. This is you asking for terms, not threatening me with strength you no longer have. Salvatore's composure cracked, just slightly, the fury underneath finally showing through. You'll regret this, Cross. Both of you. Maybe, Damian said. But you'll regret it from a federal detention cell, which is considerably worse. The men Damian had stationed outside moved in before Salvatore fully processed the trap he'd walked into. The confrontation ending not in violence, but in the quiet. Controlled arrest Damian's federal contacts had been waiting weeks to execute. Once Grace's plan had given them exactly the evidence they needed to move. Grace stood in the doorway through all of it, watching the man who had threatened her father, who had photographed her at a cafe weeks earlier, who had built an entire campaign of fear around a relationship that had started with nothing more than a misdirected text, finally led away in handcuffs with none of the power he'd carried into that room. It's over, Damian said quietly, once the study had emptied, crossing to where she stood. For now, Grace said, still watching the space where Salvatore had stood. For good, Damian said. His organization doesn't survive this. Neither do the men who might have carried on his grudge without him. He took her hands gently, searching her face for the fear he expected to find there. Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you regret any of this? The last month, the danger, all of it? Grace thought about it seriously, the way she thought about every real question, refusing to give him an easy answer just because it might be kinder. I regret that my father had to be frightened for something that had nothing to do with him, she said finally. I don't regret you, Damian. Not for 1 second of the last month, even the parts that terrified me. She looked up at him, something steady and certain settling into her voice. You told me the truth from the very first wrong number text. Every hard thing, every dangerous thing. You handed it to me plainly instead of protecting me from it by hiding it. That's worth more to me than 5 years of easy lies ever was. 6 months passed, and the quiet that settled over Damian's world after Salvatore Reyes's arrest felt, to Grace, less like the calm after a storm and more like the first real stillness either of them had been allowed in years. She moved into his estate slowly, cautiously, keeping her own apartment for the first 3 months out of a stubborn insistence on maintaining something entirely hers. Until the drive between the two places became more inconvenience than independence, and she finally, without much ceremony, let the lease lapse. Her father recovered fully from the scare, his heart holding steady through follow-up visits that left both her parents considerably calmer than the weeks immediately after Salvatore's men had first appeared at their door. Damian visited them twice that spring, unannounced, arriving with nothing more elaborate than a bottle of wine and an easy, patient willingness to sit through her father's lengthy stories about Grace's childhood, proof, her mother told her privately. That whatever else the man carried in his other life, he understood exactly how to make himself trustworthy in the one that mattered most to her family. "You're different with them," Grace said one evening, watching Damian help her father fold a stack of lawn chairs after dinner. Laughing at something entirely unrelated to shipping routes or federal contacts or any part of the life she'd learned to accept alongside him. "I never had this," Damian said simply, once her parents had gone inside. "A family that argues about nothing important and means every word of it anyway. I didn't know what to do with it at first. And now? Now I understand why you were brave enough to hand me a plan to bring down Salvatore instead of just letting me protect you from a distance," Damian said. "You grew up trusting that the people who loved you would tell you the truth, even the hard parts. I'm still learning how to be that kind of honest with someone." "You make it easier than I expected." Grace smiled, leaning into him on the porch step, the late spring air carrying the particular, ordinary peace of an evening with nothing dangerous waiting in it at all. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad I texted the wrong number that night." "So am I," Damian said. "Though I should probably tell you Marcus called me last month. Apparently he found out who I am and wanted to apologize for the hotel receipts. As though that would somehow undo 5 years of lying to you." Grace laughed, genuinely, the sound of it easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in the earliest weeks of their strange, accidental beginning. "What did you tell him?" "That he did me the single greatest favor of my life," Damian said, "and that I intended to spend the rest of it making sure you never regretted where his mistake sent you instead." On a warm evening in early June, Damian took Grace to the same small cafe where they'd had their first real conversation. The same corner table with the 2 exits she'd learned over months together. He still noticed out of habit even when nothing in the world was hunting either of them anymore. He did not make a production of it. He simply reached across the table, the way she had reached for his hand the night he told her the truth about who he really was, and set a small velvet box beside her coffee cup. "I know exactly what you're choosing, if you say yes," Damian said. "All of it. The danger, the reach, the parts of my life that will never be simple or safe in the way most people's lives are. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, even now." Grace looked at the box, then at him, then let herself laugh, soft, disbelieving, entirely happy in a way that made the whole cafe fade quietly into the background. "You told me the truth about everything from the very first wrong number," she said. "I think I can trust you to keep doing exactly that, for as long as you're asking." She said yes before he'd even finished opening the box. And somewhere in the quiet, ordinary rhythm of that small cafe, 2 people who had found each other entirely by accident finally, deliberately, chose to stop being an accident at all. Some of the best things in life arrive by mistake. The right ones stay, not because fate demanded it, but because 2 people decided, deliberately and with open eyes, that the mistake was worth keeping. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more emotional Mafia romance stories, and share it with someone who believes the best beginnings sometimes start with the wrong number. Would you have replied to that text, or blocked the number and walked away?